What's up guys, I'm Andy from 1A Auto. In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front strut mounts on this 2001 BMW 325Xi. If you need this part or other parts for your vehicle, click the link in the description and head over to 1aauto.com. I raised the vehicle. We're using a 2-post lift. If you're doing this at your house, you can use the jack and jack stands. I'm going to remove the tire to gain extra access. It's going to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to use a 17mm socket and an air gun. You can always use a breaker bar. Take these lug nuts out, or lug studs out. I'm going to get to the last one. I'm just going to hold the wheel so it doesn't fall. Take the last one out. And grab the wheel, pull it off. I want to loosen up this nut on the link right here. I'm just going to spray some rust penetrant on the nut just to help loosen it up. I'll take a 16mm socket and a ratchet, and I'm going to loosen it first, and I'm going to switch to a wrench. I just turned the wheel a little bit to gain access to this nut so that I can use a 16mm wrench on the nut, and I'm going to hold the stud with a T27 socket and a ratchet. Check to see if a T30 fits. This one may be rusted and that's why it's a T27, but this one fits. That'll hold the stud. Okay, after a while I was able to get the T30 on the stud. I think it was just rusted, that's why it wouldn't go on originally. Loosened up that nut. Take that off there. Take the nut off so you can slide the stud out. I'm just gonna spray some rust penetrant on this bolt. It's pretty rusty. Right there, let it soak for a little bit. And just take a 18mm socket and a breaker bar. Loosen this bolt up. I'm going to switch to a ratchet, or if you have an air tool, you can use an air gun. Take this bolt out. Take that bolt out, and there's a bracket right here. Just set that bracket aside. The brake hose goes through the bracket and the ABS wire. Move that aside. So you want to take some kind of punch because we want to move the spindle down, or the knuckle down. And we're going to place it right here. Then you can take a pretty heavy hammer. We're going to tap it down. And as you can see, the strut is going. The strut is staying stationary and the knuckle is going down. At this point, it's pretty loose. I can just wiggle it back and forth, slide this down, slide this out of the way. Be careful with the drive shaft, well, the front CV shaft. You don't want to have that get pulled out or anything. Just slide that to the side. Just make sure that stays like that. Should be okay. I am going to take a bungee cord, just hook onto here and hook around the lower control arm. I'm just trying to prevent this whole thing from sliding out. Just hook that there. And hook this over here. That should be good. Then it's not gonna pop the CV boot out or anything. All right, now I'm gonna take these 3 nuts off. I'm gonna use a 13mm socket and a ratchet. Be careful not to arc out your ratchet on this stud right here. There should be a cover on here. This vehicle does not have one. So, take these off. All right, from underneath, I'm actually gonna grab the strut itself And from on top, I'll just take out this last nut and just use a gun. You can use an air gun. Loosen it up and take it out. Just slide it down and slide it out. We're going to take that strut assembly and put it into a strut compressor machine. They do make different home devices that you can use to compress the spring. Just be careful. With this in here, I'm going to take a straight blade screwdriver, just pop this cap off. Right there, I can access the nut. Now I'm going to compress the spring. I'm just compressing the strut, rechecking it, just making sure once the strut is loose, then I'm able to loosen up the nut. Just being very careful. So there's actually a tool to remove this nut from the strut mount so that you can get the strut out and take the mount off. It would be like a 21mm socket with a long handle on it, and then you can use a hex socket or a hex bit to hold the shaft from spinning, but we don't have that. So what I'm going to do is take some locking pliers, and I know this is not recommended, but we're going to be high up on the shaft, so it's never going to reach down below there. We're going to lock onto the shaft. Now why they don't want you to use locking pliers is because if it mars up the shaft at all, if the shaft goes down to where the seal is, it's going to mess up the seal. But the shaft is never going to get compressed into the strut assembly that deep. So with my locking pliers there, I'm going to take my 21mm socket and an air gun, take off the nut. Be careful, the strut is probably going to fall and hit the ground. Actually, I have the locking pliers holding it, so it won't. Take the nut off and slide the mount off. Here's the bottom part of the bearing. Set that aside. Now grab the strut and loosen up the locking pliers. Pull that out. Here's the old part. Here's the new strut mount from 1AAuto.com. Has the bearing in the middle, same as the old one. Has the same stud configuration. Has this little index tab. Comes with new nuts. Get yours at 1AAuto.com and you can do it yourself. Carefully slide the strut back into the spring. Get that lined up. Take the new mount. And there is a washer at the base of this. Leave that washer there. Put the new mount on. Take the new nut. So if you had the proper tool, this is when you would want to tighten this down. The proper tool looks something like this. This happens to be an O2 sensor socket. What that would do is go on the nut right there, and then you could take the hex bit. This happens to be a 7mm hex bit on a socket, and you could hold that like that and then use your torque wrench and tighten down the nut. So since we don't have that specific tool, what I'm going to do is use some locking pliers. Again, this isn't recommended, but this is the best we can do. We're going to grab the top part of the shaft. That way, at the top part of the shaft, it's not going to hit the seal at all. And there's no way it could compress that much, so it's not that big of a deal. And then I'm going to take a socket. It seems like the new nut that comes with the strut seems more like a 7/8 socket versus a 21 or a 13/16. And then I'm going to hold the locking pliers and tighten this nut to 47 foot-pounds. And there we go, we're already there. Now I can take the locking pliers off. Just like I said before, make sure when you grab onto the shaft, it's really high up. You don't want to grab it down low. I can put this cover on. All right, so we want to make sure the spring is lined up properly down below, the way this, pretty much the way it came out. And then we'll loosen up on this compressor. Just be careful when doing this type of job. A lot of times the springs can do some crazy things. It's pretty dangerous. Slide those out. And there we go. Now we can install it in the car. So with the strut, I want this little tab right here facing towards the vehicle, and there's this little index tab that's gonna line up right there. So slide this in from underneath, just like that. Get the studs to go through, and I'll take these nuts. I'm gonna get these all started, and you can kind of see where you want to tighten this down, kind of where it was before. Then when you go to have an alignment done, it'll be closer. It's a good idea to have an alignment done after you do this repair to make sure your tires don't get burned out going down the road. All right, I am gonna leave these two nuts a little bit loose first because I want to slide this into position before we tighten those up. So this little tab is gonna go through that groove. So spin that in the proper location. Push that like that. Just wiggle that a little bit. So with that lined up, I'm just gonna take a floor jack and get underneath the control arm, right under the ball joint. Actually, I'll take that off. And start pressing up on that. Make sure it goes in there correctly. Just wiggle it back and forth a little bit. So I'm just pushing, just using the floor jack. Put a little bit of pressure, pushing up. Just be careful with your fingers, don't get anything caught. So our strut has bottomed out on our knuckle, which is good. So I'm gonna take the bolt. It's probably a good idea to get a replacement bolt for this, but make sure you take this bracket, line the bracket up, and slide the bolt in. Now if you can't get the bolts into this position, then your strut's probably not all the way down or it's twisted, but there is that guide pin that should line up with that channel, so you should be all set. Just gonna take a 18mm socket and a ratchet. Just tighten this down first. I'm gonna take my 18mm socket and a torque wrench. I'm gonna torque this bolt to 74 foot-pounds. All right, that's good. Now I'm gonna tighten these upper nuts down. Oops. Now with these nuts tightened down, I'm just gonna use a 12mm socket and a torque wrench. I'm gonna tighten these to 21 foot-pounds. Now with the strut all tightened in there, I can lower the floor jack. At this point, you can remove the bungee cord. Take that off. The sway bar link. Slide that in position. Take a 14mm wrench, put it on the back side on the stud. And take the nut, get the nut started. Take a 15mm socket and ratchet, tighten this up. Then use the torque wrench and torque this nut to 47 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to put the wheel on. Just line up the holes. Take one of the lug studs, get that started. And I can grab the other ones. Now I'll just tighten these down, and then I'm going to lower the vehicle and torque them. All right, now I'm going to use a 17mm socket and a torque wrench. I'm going to torque these lug bolts to 95 foot-pounds. I'm going to torque them in a star pattern so that the wheel gets tightened down evenly. Then I'm just going to go around again, just double check. Good to go.
Thanks for watching. Visit 1AAuto.com, your place for DIY auto repairs, for great parts, great service, and more content.